Session 3, Problems at the Periphery. And in a way, it's a sort of continuation, I think, of the dialogue from the Super Session 1, possible mediums, and more particularly, I suspect, a kind of continuation of the conversation from this morning's second session, the core today. And so the intention of particularly these last two sessions is to in a way, sort of recenter the kind of larger theme of the conference, which is what is the role of the center and the periphery in relation both to education and practice. And so in some ways, the kind of, I should say the format for this afternoon, the second session was purely a discussion. I've asked our 5 presenters to give a very short, sort of 5 to 8 minute position piece on what they understand to be questions at the periphery, and then with the intention that the second half of the panel is really a kind of discussion emerging from what was presented. So we have 5 speakers, which I'll introduce in a moment, and really, in a way, the one could understand problems at the periphery is there are two readings maybe. One is, what are the challenges of occupying the margins of the peripheries, or what are the questions that the periphery should be addressing? I think some other questions are, what is, there's I think a larger question of what is there a periphery? Is that a kind of, I think there's a sort of question of, is the core and the periphery a kind of gradient, or are there actually distinct zones? And if there is a periphery, what is its role? Should it act as a new frontier of knowledge? Should it act as a provocateur to the kind of what we might understand as core knowledge? And what is its instrumentality relative to academia, research, or practice? So these are some of the questions that I'll pose back to our presenters. So the 5 speakers that we have today, John May is a partner with Zeina Koretem of Millions, a Los Angeles-based architecture practice with projects in Beirut, New York, and California. And he's a founding co-director with Zeynep Çelik Alexander of the Instruments Project, a multi-year research collaborative that examines philosophical, historical, and political dimensions of contemporary design technologies. And he's taught at UCLA. He's currently teaching at U of T and has taught at many other institutions. Carolyn O'Donnell is the principal of CODA, an experimental design and research studio operating at a range of scales from the urban to the architectural. She's the Edgar A. Tafel Assistant Professor and Director of the MArch program at Cornell University, and she's the editor of the Cornell Journal of Architecture and former founding editor of Pigeon magazine coming out of Princeton University. Maya Przybylski is assistant professor at the University of Architecture at the School of Architecture at the University of Waterloo, and she's co-director with Mona El Kafif of Data Lab, a research group investigating the expansion and information-centric design methodologies of the built world. In her own work, Maya is exploring the role of computation in developing ecologically informed design strategies. And she's a graduate of the University of Toronto Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design, but also has a prior degree in software engineering from the Department of Computer Science at U of T. Matthew Soules, from the University of British Columbia, explores relationships between sociopolitical ideology and contemporary architecture and urbanism. He pursues work through a range of activities from writing and research to design of object spaces and buildings. He's published extensively. He's been awarded a number of awards, including the ACSA Faculty Design Awards. And finally, Robert Stuart-Smith is from the Architectural Association School of Architecture, and he's also the director of Robert Stuart-Smith Design and co-founding director of the research practice Kokuja. I hope I got that right. Working in projects in the UK, China, and Indonesia. And he is a master, is a course master at the AADRL master's program, and has taught at RMIT, the MIT Media Lab, and has lectured at various institutions. So with that, I will turn it over to the first speaker. Maya, you're up first, Maya, I believe.
Okay, so first off, thanks to Lola and David for the invitation today, and to all the panelists who will share some ideas with us, and hopefully all of you to join in the conversation. So my talk today is called Prepping for the Periphery. And as a way of examining problems at the periphery, my plan for today is to position the periphery as a dynamic, multi-relational territory, and I'll use a nascent research project to reflect on some observations from the periphery. So first, I offer that we could think about the periphery as a dynamic, multi-relational territory, a complex territory. If we talk about periphery, we imply center, and I think it's useful to speculate on a relationship between these things. So we could attribute a force, a pull, a gravity to this relationship. For example, we know that as objects move away from one another, the gravitational pull between them decreases. So to add another layer of complexity to this idea of periphery, we can also acknowledge that in a disciplinary universe, we are not alone. And so with the decreasing pull of an object as it moves outward, it becomes more susceptible to influence from other previously ineffectual centers. So maybe we can think of these centers as disciplines, as we're doing here, and the peripheral project residing somewhere in this force field. So as we move a project away from our disciplinary center, we are increasingly exposed to forces of other disciplines around us. And of course, we can modulate this influence by changing the relative mass or weight. So here I've shown architecture and the ecological sciences as some of these centers. Of course, they can be anything, but in my work, these are particularly interesting. And so to make this point a little bit more tangible, I'll elaborate very quickly on an emerging research interest that I see is trying to pull me out into the periphery. So I'm specifically interested in the work of researchers and practitioners developing ecologically informed strategies. And the projects that I'm interested in are trying to do two things. First, they acknowledge the lessons from the ecological sciences by presenting sites as dynamic, interconnected, resilient, and indeterminate. And secondly, more importantly, they attempt to position strategies of design within this flux. So as a shorthand, given the length of this talk, we can reference projects operating in and around the ecological urbanism discourse, where projects are seen to both affect and be affected by an inclusive set of environmental, social, and economic factors. So it's interesting to me that in this very foundational volume of the discourse, Chris Reed, in his essay entitled The Agency of Ecology, calls for, in quotes, a fuller, more engaged approach to the ecological aspect of ecological urbanism. So in the context of these relational centers or peripheries that I'm talking about, I interpret this as a call to move a little closer to a foreign center, that of ecological science, and thereby a little further out into our own periphery. So it's important to note that ecology in this sense is taken in a kind of contemporary definition, and it's not where it means this, and it's not a synonym for environment, and it's not a synonym for green. And so while this sort of the body of work around ecological urbanism has been incredibly useful in foregrounding and speculating on ecologically informed design, it appears as though some kind of limit is being approached. Ecologist S.T.A. Pickett has offered that our appropriation of the ecological sciences, meaning the design community's appropriation of the ecological sciences, is based mostly on metaphor. And so authors assert the presence and the agencies associated with this suite of concerns of the ecological urbanist, but stop short of directly confronting the actual complexity. So that's all okay. Metaphor is a great point of entry into disciplinary appropriation. It's a really useful communication tool to accessibly summarize mind frames, concepts, and approaches and values. But Pickett, as an ecologist, reminds us that there's a lot that we're missing. There's a rich technical world, again in quotes, behind each metaphor. And so, taking Reed and Pickett together, it seems to me that moving beyond metaphor and confronting some of this richness is an exciting research space. So the project that I'm sort of in the very early phases of working on is poised to move towards our periphery by increasing the pull of the ecological sciences. So far I've been particularly interested in looking at a kind of very robust modeling procedure that's set up within the ecological sciences. I'm looking to their use of fieldwork and its recording, and their process-oriented perspective in managing their space of concern. So these were kind of the three first mechanisms by which to engage in this rich technical world. So given the setup of this talk, I'll end by offering 4 reflections in the context of problems at the periphery. The first one has to do with emerging influences. So as you move away from one center towards another, ever more new centers can come into effect. So basically pulling you further and further away from your original orbit. In this project, very quickly, it became evident that computation would become a third agent. And so obviously this points to challenges around further diluting the expertise of the originating center. And it also sets up, I'm almost done. Okay. It sets up a mechanism for basically a perpetual expansion and almost like kind of crippling kind of weight of complexity if you're kind of continuously welcoming these external orbits. The second reflection operates on the assumption that you might want to make your way back, so returning to the center. And so this project operates on the assumption that we have something to learn from the ecological sciences. They've been handling dynamics, interconnection, and complexity using computation since the 1970s. So it does seem like we can kind of appropriate some knowledge from them, from the discipline. And given that, being kind of pulled out to the periphery, I wonder how we might rework, adapt the findings from this far position back into our center, which seems to be a bit of a challenge. And then a third reflection offers that maybe a return to a kind of ancestral center isn't at all necessary. So it's possible to imagine that enough relatable activity exists at the periphery that a new center with its own gravitational pull and orbiters begins to emerge. And if that's the case, how do we foster such consolidation? And how does this consolidation, this new center, resolve itself with relation to its lineage? And then the final reflection is one around tools and new skills and tools. So it seems to me like this kind of voyage or expedition out into the periphery requires 2 families of skills and tools to exist. So on the one hand, there's the need to develop a capacity and expertise in order to operate within some specific constellation of centers. So in this case, computation, ecological science, and architecture. And that's a kind of one set of things to consider. And on the other hand, maybe a kind of meta level of skill is necessary where we are enabled to, as designers, maybe resist, amplify, and counteract the forces in this kind of peripheral ecology or universe of forces, to actively, as a kind of design act, reposition a project within this force field over its lifespan. Yeah, so I think I'll end there. I mean, this is a project that's taking up the most space on my desk, and it seems to be kind of a call to go on some kind of adventure out there, and just offering some thoughts about how I might kind of approach it from the context of the problem of the periphery. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I decided today to actually talk much more from my own personal dilemma at the moment with design research. I think that's kind of where it's at. So these are the 3 categories I operate within. On the left, you have the AA-DRL, the Design Research Laboratory at the AA, where I teach. Then my practice that tries to build buildings. Not enough of them, but and then Kakuja, which is basically a framework I share with Roland Snooks, where we do experimental research, either sometimes for paid clients and most of the time as self-initiated research. So the academic framework that this sits within, the design research laboratory, like, I don't know how well you can see that, but I think it's sitting in a very precarious position, which I find quite interesting, like, where it's somewhere between the typical 4-month master's design studio and a research lab that runs, PhD students or research assistants for multiple years. In the DRL, students work in teams of 3 or 4 students on a thesis project for 1 year, and they're in the program for 1.5 years. And they overlap with each other, and we tend to run briefs for more than 1 year, like with variations. So I see this as something that is both a positive and negative thing in one sense, but I see the key advantage of the design studio and also the DRL out of the 3 here is their ability to speculate. The research lab depends where it's really getting funding from, depends how free it is to speculate. So there are cases of research labs being quite independent, but at the same time there are also cases where research labs sometimes have their feet tied. So the advantage there is maybe a nimbleness in the DRL. And the studio I've been running there over the last year was looking into swarm-constructed architecture. And this involved a number of different facets that the research had to undertake from, like, you can see them on the board, but there was technical research, like, in terms of hardware for printing, 3D printing, based on attaching that to quadcopters or multicopters. Design methodology research, which involved scripting and writing computer programs that would run a simulation and also on the drones. And then physical work into understanding flight, understanding material behavior, and then speculative design. So all these facets, I'm sure you all share these in different degrees, like we all sit somewhere more on one topic or another, but it's very difficult to undertake those within a 4-month studio at the same level where they each have the same weighting. And in this case, even with 1 year to work with the students, there was still a lot of people involved. We had structural engineers engaging with the students on a regular basis, teaching assistants, one was a computer scientist, and then industry support. Like, we brought in people from industry to not just kind of pick our brain, but actually sit around on Skype and Google Talk conferences and actually share GitHub repositories and really have an opinion on some of the things the students were doing. At the same time, they had no vested interest and no rights to the work, and there was no conflict there. It was at a very early stage before anything was really done. But it meant that the students could really get up to speed. So this is some of the kinds of things that were going on. We were understanding how to control the phase changing of things like ice, being able to keep it supercooled water, being able to keep it liquid well below 0 degrees Celsius, or developing hardware for resin deposition for 3D printing. Now, these are things that are very technical. Normally, I would associate those with a kind of engineering department, but simply the things we wanted to do weren't there. They weren't available off the shelf. And at the same time, by working on them, you gain an intuition for what you can do with them and how they can work. And in this case, these are students wanting to 3D print something horizontally as a cantilever. So then there's algorithmic work, also understanding how to do things like real-time anticipatory structural analysis. So, when something's not working quite well, stop what you're doing, go back and fix the problem before moving on. And understanding how that can lead to non-linear and not so self-evident sequences of construction through flight of quadcopters, 3D printing a structure that starts by cantilevering from multiple positions and always moving forward only in a way that's feasible to be done without scaffolding. So the kind of programming required in this is quite bespoke. There's no software that you can just buy off the shelf for this type of thing. And the programming's done to align with all the material discoveries that are happening in parallel. And they lead to projects like this, where the construction sequence is just as important as the project. And that the details of the project are very much embedded within the way it was made and the way it was conceived and the constraints of the physics of flying. And on top of that, the work was looking into things like computer vision and positioning systems. And in the DRL, we really don't have much budget, so all the equipment is basically funded by the students themselves or the staff. And so for instance, in this case, we can't afford external positioning, so everything has to be done through computer vision, which is why you have things like the lines painted, like the tape on the floor, so that the cameras or the drones can perceive the space they're in. So this kind of work, the question is, where do you take this type of thing? Like, when it's so technical, you can do a certain level. And at the same time, if you want to progress it further, it requires a little bit of funding or expertise. So we're in conversations at the moment. We're collaborating on grant proposals with a whole bunch of different disciplines, which, if that happens, would allow for, let's say, the equipment and so forth. But it also starts to question which aspects of the work would we be taking forward, and which aspects of the work would we be doing in collaboration, and which parts would we hand off, and what would be the topic of such a research grant. And I haven't really come to a conclusion on these things, but I think they raise interesting questions because, for instance, a lot of the work, I sat down with a meeting just 2 days ago about some of the hardware investigations with a robotics engineer. And, obviously they can do those kinds of things in a far more advanced way than we can, but at the same time, unless we're actually working on them, we don't actually discover the things we want to discover. Like, a lot of the work was driven by intuition that the students gained by working on these problems. So I think the solution from at least my side with that is that we actually do those things together with engineers, not that we carve it up into different pieces of the pie, but we have a very meaningful and close relationship. But that leads to my last slide, which I think this experience is actually leading more to questions than answers, but I would say that there are a lot of dualisms that we have to consider when we're dealing with design research, like, for instance, nimbleness versus longevity. A research grant gives longevity, funding, but at the same time, the ability to change your mind or start something from the beginning, or start something on a whim even, I think is important within design research, not only just to be following, or for instance, self-initiated versus in-demand. So not just to be following, for instance, the funding categories that governments or universities provide, or what is popular or of concern at the time. And similarly, for instance, solving problems or creating opportunities. Like, I think some good design research starts sometimes by just seeing an opportunity. It's not always that we must be solving a direct problem. Like, if we do that, then we're only going to answer the problems we're aware of now, and we won't be posing potential new futures. So, and yeah, I think you can see the other two there, speculative versus real and autonomous versus collaborative. I don't think any of these necessarily should be argued from one side. I think both sides of the versus is important. So, for instance, collaboration is important, but I think also having some autonomy is important, that we have freedom within the profession, for instance, to, even amongst ourselves, to be doing different research, but that research is driven by concerns that we as a profession have, not necessarily just by what society at large demands from us. So, thank you.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to thank David and Lola for arranging for this amazing carpet, which is obviously core versus periphery themed, right? You have it all over the hotel. So I don't know how you pulled that off, but it's really impressive. Looking at Maya's slides and the carpet together really blew my mind. I also want to suggest that either you guys or somebody else wants to take on the project of mapping out all of the terms that were used in all the titles of the papers to see, if we have dots the size of a certain peripheral element, how big are some of the dots? Obviously, linguistics might be there, but it might be a small dot. Technology, robotics might be there for sure. And I think maybe I would wager that the biggest dot could be ecology. I think I'm certainly going to talk about it because it's my own interest, but and maybe I'm projecting, but I really saw a lot of creatures in this this conference, and I wondered, am I just seeing things now because I want to? But I started to reflect on, and this is really a reflection, it's often, some of these thoughts are really only half thought, but what happened in the last few days, and you know, what, coming out of that, could we think about the core versus the periphery? And what do all of these creatures mean, actually? These are some of the creatures by Clark Tenhouse, which are beautiful, beautiful creatures. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion. So I should say creatures in the sense of animals, but also kind of closed objects or things. There's been discussion about object-oriented ontology. Jonathan Massey in his presentation. Are you here, Jonathan? So you can defend yourself. I wrote some things down that he said. He wanted to revive figuration in his new imaginary program. He said something about things that were cute and creatures that could mate with each other. And then there's a list of, just a quick list of topics that seem to deal with these issues. Marcelo Spina's mute icons are an argument towards mute icons, glittering ugly objects, headless bellies, stones of teeth, balloon animals, and so on, creature comforts. I want to quickly go through 2 slides that say, I also do this, so before I start to critique it, I'm part of the problem. I also make objects and animals. But I was, what really made me think had a big effect on me was Ellie Abrams' headless bellies and other forms of architectural illusion. Is Ellie here? That could be good or bad. Ellie described really well the difference between what she called illusion, which is a kind of personality, versus character, what she called meaning. And she talked specifically about this project by Bitter Tang Farm. And this is called mustachio. And these leg-like protrusions that were kind of, let's say, the personality, the illusion of the object, rather than the meaning of the object. And I started to wonder, how is a leg a leg? How do we know if that protrusion, or those 2 protrusions in that potato-like object at the bottom, how could we say that's a leg rather than a nose, for example? How do we know when a leg is a leg and not something that kind of is leggish-y? I guess my answer, which again is not really thought out because these are new thoughts, is a leg is a leg because of its relationships to other things, maybe to the ground, because of its relationship to a body, and because of its function, maybe, because one knows that one can walk with it. So maybe these are not legs because you can't walk with them, but they have the personality of legs. What makes me nervous about this kind of new, what seems kind of new to me, return to the object or return to the creature as an entity, is a very old problem of the insertion of an object into a scene without the object's ability to be malleable and to respond to that scene. This is a Filaretti drawing of an ideal city in a context where the ideal city doesn't change at all because of its context. The other thing that we heard a lot of in, a little less I would say, but certainly in the session I was in yesterday, is talk about the Anthropocene. That was also mentioned a couple of times in these sessions in discussions of what would a kind of ideal architectural program be. So balancing this animal creature, there's the concern about not just the environment that it's in, but the kind of declining, decaying, almost like atomic fallout landscape in which we are living. And it seems to me maybe that these 2 things are pretty opposed. We heard a lot of both of those things, but I'm not sure that we heard a lot about the stitching of those 2 things together. And maybe I would go as far as to say, and again, these are new thoughts, that maybe we could say the object fixation, the creature fixation, is the core of the discipline in a way. And the scene, the background, the Anthropocene is, and this is where I'm not sure either, it's one of these molecules very far away, which is the large molecule of ecology, or it's also part of the core and it's kind of fundamental to the existence of this object. So the role of the background, the role of the scene, even in this Bitter Tang Farm image, the mustachio, why are these objects photographed on a quilt What does the background mean in this image? Is it a child's toy? Is it some sort of sex toy? I'm not really sure which one the quilt implies, but certainly it's different from these objects existing on a white background. And it reminds me actually of this theory by Lev Kuleshov from 1919, the filmmaker, in which he hypothesizes that the background actually changes the meaning or the reading of the foreground. The objects, I have to say, were not totally, the ones that I saw in the presentation are not totally self-obsessed. They're actually obsessed with themselves and the perception, so the viewing subject in relation to that object. But I guess I'm suggesting that we could go further than the object and the subject in dialogue, but that the object can also be influenced by and be in dialogue with a broader context. So in this case, this is Francesco De Marchi's one of his cities in which the urban form doesn't remain ideal once it gets put into its context, but is actually malleable and therefore in dialogue with it. Or the possibility that the kind of ideal church or architectural object could also be considered malleable, and that through that malleability it would also have a renewed meaning. So I think the problem actually, and maybe this comes to the question of the peripheral elements and how they connect to the core, is that when we borrowed from ecology through Darcy Thompson, we borrowed the object and forgot about its background. So, what is it that's making these fish change their forms? Obviously, there are forces from the outside that Thompson never drew. And the same, what is it with Darwin's 13 finches that made them all become distinct? Obviously, there are a range of different kind of inputs from the context that are forcing those changes. I promised yesterday I wouldn't show this again, but I lied. So maybe thinking rather than these little objects here that are kind of completely self-contained and representable in a kind of closed way with a white background, maybe we need to think about the architectural object more like the animal exists in collaboration with its environment, which is not so easily represented as an object, but actually kind of reaches out and draws in different elements of its environment. So I guess in the end, I'm saying yes to making objects strange and weird, but let's make them strange and weird in dialogue with their backgrounds. We don't, bubbles only exist for so long before they have to smash into the parts of reality like gravity and air and other objects. Thanks.
I should start by saying that I think that David and Lola have correctly diagnosed the mindset of academic architecture today, but I'd have to say that mindset has really never made any sense to me. And so I'm going to try to explain why that is and why I don't think anything I do is peripheral, and why I don't think there's a center or a periphery. And I think the crux of that will be that I think that it's very easy to confuse disciplinarity for thought. And I think those two things are fundamentally different. And I'll try to explain why I think they're different and how that relates to maybe some work that I've been doing in collaboration with other people. So first of all, if we try to figure out what a discipline is, it seems to me that a discipline is primarily a kind of seemingly stable but actually pretty unstable set of what you might call disciplinary realities, which are economic and institutional and political and nepotistic and submissive in a lot of ways. Some of them are organizations like the ACSA. You can have cultures of awards and prizes and things like that. If you keep going, you can get into, I've never personally been on tenure track, but I know many people who are on tenure track. And tenure track is obviously an extremely complicated set of rules, guidelines, most of which are written by non-architects. And maybe one point of conversation would be the effect of the Scientific Research University on architectural thought over the last 50 years. And this is just a document that's available online. You can see from the bar on the left, it's probably 50 or 60 pages long on how to get tenure at U of T. And then, of course, layered on top of that, there are a whole series of economic realities like, U of T has a budget, it's a public school, it's sitting within a government, within a nation state. And again, the impact that these kinds of things have on something like the shape of a discipline. We could keep going. I mean, sometimes when I think about our discipline, I think maybe one of the most stable things we have is accreditation. That is, every school in North America has to somehow submit to this strange set of rules and this strange ritual that happens every 5 years. And that's a fairly lengthy document as well. So these are all fairly obvious, I think, disciplinary realities that do have shapes, they do have forms. That I would still argue that they're relatively unstable, but they might feel stable to us in the present. The work that I've been doing for the past couple of years maybe would point to two additional, I'll just really quickly point to two additional categories that maybe are less obvious, and one of those belongs to the work that we've been doing in the Instruments Project, which is really an attempt to look at the technological substrate of our disciplinary thinking. We started to realize, we've known for a while, but we really started to realize in recent years that the nature of evidence that's being marshaled in architecture schools and in the profession has changed profoundly over the past couple decades. And it's clear at this point that we are fully immersed in what you might call the epistemology of data. And so we wanted to take several years to try to figure out what data actually is, to look at it as clearly as we can. Where did it come from? How did it historically emerge? How does it interact with much longer standing concepts like nature, like automation, customization, all kinds of performance, as was brought up on the earlier panel today. And so we've spent a couple of years now looking at the technical genealogy of a whole series of instruments, and we split this up into, we didn't know how else to work on it other than to split it up into a series of very generic gerunds: sensing, modeling, scanning, customizing, specifying, and just to try to take a kind of archaeological core sample of all of those as techniques. What you find when you get down to the bottom is it has a way of eliminating this core periphery distinction. That is, we're all kind of swimming in a common soup, and we don't really understand that soup terribly well. I think we marshal it, we use it to make certain kinds of arguments, either for the core or the periphery, but we've done that, we've done so, or we oftentimes do so without having looked very carefully at where that data comes from. And it has a very curious relationship with how things get deemed natural or artificial, organic or processed, these kinds of basic distinctions, built or natural. So that's one set. I think there is a kind of technical substrate that we tend to not take seriously, and that probably needs to be taken seriously. I'm not an historian, but the group of collaborators, there are a number of historians in that, and so we're kind of trying to take it on as a historical philosophical problem and pose a series of basic questions that maybe sit beneath a lot of the disciplinary work that's being done. The other that I've just written about very recently, and one of the weird things about putting your PDFs on a website is that you suddenly can see the statistics for which of your essays get read more often or less often than others. And I always had this fallacy that I always had this incorrect impression that certainly the essays I work on the hardest are the ones that people read the most, and that's absolutely, completely inversely true. The fact is the shorter ones get read much more often, and this is one that I wrote very recently just about the history of the jury system. I've wondered since grad school, when did we start behaving as though architectural objects required legal defenses? And when did school take on that particular structure? And it turns out it really was relatively recently, and of course it's an American phenomena, because Americans, there's always a right or a wrong, and I say that as an American. This is an image from one of the earliest thesis defenses in front of an open jury, and obviously this replaced the closed jury system of the Beaux-Arts system. And so maybe one thing we could talk about is the complete inversion that happened as a result of that between discourse and objects, that is, between what we might think of as a kind of internally, historically constituted orthographic form of communication that we used to have, that we no longer have, to one in which one stands up and basically defends a thesis or an idea, and the object is the kind of star witness at that trial. So these are all I'm just putting a series of questions on the table, I guess. It seems to me that as a result of all of these disciplinary realities, I think disciplines are generally very, like academia in general, are generally very useful things. So, useful artifices so long as one remains aware of their artificiality. And I think one of the things that's happening in architecture schools today is that thought is actually beginning to resonate with the core periphery model and has forgotten that it's a model. And this is one of, when historians of science write about what is the power of a model to convince, it is this slipperiness between analogy and ontology. And I think when you forget that an analogical model is not ontological, and then you begin to behave as though it's ontological, then you will perform that work at the level of your own thought, and you will forget about the substrate which made that possible in the first place. So that's my, I personally have never thought of my work as peripheral. I've never thought of it as the core. I just think of it as curiosity and work, and we all make things. And, but it is, I think it's absolutely true that I feel at times out of step with my generation in that we seem to have drawn these battle lines which don't seem to make a lot of sense when we look relatively closely at them. So, thank you.
Hold all of my thoughts just in my head, but anyway, so I'll wing it a little bit. So I'm going to talk about a kind of, let's say, a sort of old problem, if we could call it that, an old question, which is the relationship between design, architecture, and capital. So, 2010 book, The Long 20th Century, the very opening line of which is, over the last quarter century, something fundamental seems to have changed in the way that capitalism works. So we all, of course, know that, live that, feel that. But I think the way that capitalism has shifted in the last 2 decades has profound implications for the built environment generally and architecturally, disciplinarity within that. So when we think about what has changed, I think there's a number of ways to describe that change, and I think probably the most kind of efficient way to describe it is the rise to predominance of a very unique kind of form of capitalism, which is finance capitalism. So, different debates exist about this sort of position of finance capitalism within the overall logics of capitalism. Is it in a kind of originary, cyclical manner that has always been present in capital, or is it something that actually happens in a more teleological historical development in a kind of more classic, maybe Marxist perspective? But basically, finance capitalism is unique in the sense that it, of course, prefaces the production of capital through the exchange of financial instruments such as stocks, derivatives themselves, as opposed to, say, industrial capitalism, which is about producing commodities and selling them at markup. So finance capitalism, we could say, is a kind of post-productive mode of capitalism. So I think there's an incredible array of profound but yet often simple phenomena that exist within finance capitalism. So they're in isolation simple, but when you consider them in relation to each other, they comprise a very complex sort of spatio financial ecosystem. So one of which is the kind of unprecedented amount of capital that exists in the world, right? So since 1990, we've gone from about $12 trillion to about $80 trillion. And so the relationship, or the importance and significance for architecture or the built environment is the sheer amount of money out of this giant pool that flows through the built environment. So this is totally new, totally unprecedented. Simultaneous to the kind of growth of the giant pool of money is, of course, growing inequities in how that money is distributed. So, the Gini coefficient that charts inequity is marching up in all Western economies, or pretty much all economies except for a handful. So this kind of divide and the emergence of the high net worth individual and its kind of global proliferation. And then simultaneous to this is the way in which space, built form, is financialized to kind of respond to the demands and desires of high net worth individuals and the giant pool of money. So mortgage-backed securities are something that is ushered into law in the 1960s, but don't really take off until the 1990s when finance capitalism kind of brings them to the fore. And there's many economists that argue that they're basically a kind of a circuit that is invented and proliferated to respond to the giant pool of money. So basically, this debt financing, this financialization of architecture, is something that Saskia Sassen kind of refers to as the financialization of non-financial domains. So all of this amounts to a scenario in which the securitization and debt financing that makes space possible becomes insanely significant to the world economy. So much so that in the USA, UK, and Australia, for instance, 70% of all bank loans are real estate mortgages. And in all developed countries amount to 40% of GDP. So what we're kind of able to say is that today's post-industrial economy, this is in the word of Michael Hudson, turns out to be mainly about real estate. And I think where it was once possible to talk about the industrial military complex as a kind of site of power and the kind of exercise of kind of systemic structural performance across society, that we can begin to scrutinize what we might call the investment architectural complex as a kind of driving locale of power in contemporary society. So I want to just then quickly address, so there's so many ways and places you could take this, of course, right? So I just want to address 4 quick things that I think are kind of, let's say, problems. So one is a kind of a strange journey that is, of course, getting more and more attention, which is the degree to which architecture is increasingly outside of use value, right? So a kind of, not a post-human condition, I would say a kind of unhuman condition, a non-human condition. So where inhabitation of structure is increasingly, inhabitation of form, structure is increasingly insignificant to its logics and performance, right? Which is a kind of, I would say, a very bizarre and strange return to a kind of surprising form of purity. So it's, and I think it's both, can be understood as kind of limiting and kind of, let's say limiting, but then that lurking within it is a sort of strange form of potential, a kind of return to a possibility of new forms of monumentality and kind of architectural elementalism that is a kind of surprise byproduct of the logics of capital. So the sort of new monuments outside of humanness. Another kind of question is, I think, has to do with how much of contemporary urban and architectural discourse is grounded within 2 sort of divergent yet simultaneous ideas about urbanization. And so one is the sort of Shenzhen speed model of basing ontologies of architectural production on hyper-growth models and a kind of heroicism around that. And then simultaneous to that, of course, the sort of contraction model. So it's Shenzhen speed on one side, Detroit contraction on the other. And I think the things about kind of finance capitalism and its logics in the built environment is that they actually accelerate the sort of boom and bust cycles to such a degree that expansion and contraction are really less and less temporally and spatially separated. So they become to be simultaneous conditions. And I think that simultaneity destabilizes a lot of the kind of both ontological and epistemological kind of frameworks of how we understand what we do in the world as designers. So third point is really the degree to which, like as built matter is financialized, the way in which it's pulled closer and closer into forms of abstraction that instrumentalize the exchange of representations of it. And so these can be found in super literal ways, but pre-sales of housing have existed for a very, very long time, of course. But the pre-sale, the sort of culture of pre-sales is accelerating, and the amount of exchange that happens of pre-sold quantas of architecture is accelerating. So I think what this kind of points towards is a kind simultaneous to a kind of after-human architecture, a kind of post-materiality architecture. So you might say that financialization is on the leading edge of a kind of architecture without matter, a kind of new virtuality, not virtual reality, but more a kind of real virtuality, we might say. So then lastly, so this is a new tower that just broke ground in Vancouver, where I teach on Friday, and it's Bjarke Engel's project, and it's marketed as a super prime property, right? So it's strategically marketed to the high net worth individuals, the ultra high net worth individuals. And when you go to the sales site, there's 20 reasons listed on why to invest in this property. The first of which is that it's a super prime property, existing in a super prime cities that are located on the map. But reason 16 is quite an interesting one. So world housing. So basically it announces that this program is the world's first one-to-one real estate gifting model. So for every home sold in this condo, a home will be built for a family in need in some area of the world. And I think what this is kind of, in 2006, Zizek had an interesting little piece in the London Review of Books titled "Nobody Has to Be Vile." And it was about how essentially Davos had been taken over by a group of people that referred to themselves as liberal communists. And in their kind of liberal communist position, they saw a complete smooth working of entrepreneurial generation of profit that was ethically acceptable because of the way in which it took environmental degradation and social inequity seriously. So, and Zizek talks about kind of the philanthropic mode of contemporary capital as this kind of ethical insulation. So I think a project like this, in its kind of dark, I would say incredibly dark, kind of dark perversion, I think addresses the degree to which, or calls into questions architecture's complicity and sort of actual resonance with a kind of mode of liberal communism that ultimately is in the service of a hyper neoliberalist agenda. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that. I think it was I think the five actually covered a really powerful range of issues from trying to, Carol and I actually really appreciated the sort of simplifying to a very legible way the kind of issues of object to environment as one might understand it in relation to core and periphery, and then I think issues of what are the sort of externalities pushing back at the discipline, but also, as John pointed out, the kind of internal structures that may be shaping the discipline. So, I mean, maybe a kind of first question ties to this idea, and I think, Caroline, you sort of ended with this call of the externalities pushing back at the kind of center, if one accepts that the center is the kind of pure object. And I think actually in light of this morning's discussion, if one looks at most architectural education, it does begin with like the simple building, and then one acknowledges some notion of site, and then it sort of one acknowledges building systems, and there is this idea that the sort of complexity grows and some recognition of externalities grow, and somehow that becomes a kind of more complex understanding of architecture. And so I'm curious, in a way, whether one needs to kind of reframe that question and whether one actually maybe needs to begin, both in education but also in practice, with the externalities. Like, does the whole question maybe need to be reversed? And I think, you know, even Rob, your sort of question of, you know, not the limits of the tools, but what is the sort of architect's role in co-opting these tools? And I think that came up in your presentation, Maya, also. The sort of, you know, if we grapple with the externalities, then what is our role in sort of taking charge of stepping outside the kind of discipline as one might understand it? So I'll leave that as a kind of open question.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by externalities.
The sort of, you know, whether one understands economics or political systems or financial structures or environmental forces or ecological forces as kind of things that are pushing back at the sort of, you know, I say this with a sort of level of sarcasm, but the kind of pure state that architecture might operate in.
I mean, I thought, like, the three of our presentations recognized that there was, capital had a certain influence on the way design research was undertaken. Like, I was discussing more in terms of, you know, how research grants come about, and both of you were talking, well, you were talking about it, John, on terms of how the university system works, and you were talking about it in terms of capital and finance and the real estate market. Whereas I kind of thought the first two presentations were more talking about how ecology operates and how, so it's almost like, I think we were identifying certain problems, but you were posing more how those problems might be addressed in terms of an ecological way of thinking through such relationships that are out there.
Although I think, like, even between Maya's and yours, there's the question also of the tools that we use, right? And I thought your observation that we tend to first step out of the discipline using metaphor and the kind of need of being precise about what we're trying to leverage when we, you know, if we engage, let's say, issues of economics, you know, what are the tools at our disposal and to engage those, and do we need to kind of start being more precise? If we're going to sort of have agency in the periphery, do we need to be precise in terms of vocabulary, in terms of the terms of engagement and so forth?
I mean, this is just off the top of my head, so, but I think of architects as being both a product and a influence on society. So it's like we are completely caught up in the economic system you mentioned, but at the same time, we're always trying to provoke and change the way we see architecture playing a role within that society. So as society is constantly changing and we're a product of it, we're also trying to understand what it is and propel it forwards in a positive way. So taking on, for instance, new tools or developing new methodologies or different ways of seeing or thinking about the problems at hand seem to be absolutely necessary, but also I think that's the agency of architecture itself, in a way. Like, to talk about the agency of architecture being the product of architecture doesn't seem right to me. I mean, that's a kind of given that we have a product there that we produce, but it's more, what is it that we're actually participating in, and how do we participate in that? So from my side, I anticipate and can see certain things changing in the way, for instance, the construction sector is working, or in the way that technology is being used. And that's something that we can either sit by the wayside and watch it happen, or we can partake in it and actually contribute to the way that could happen. And that, of course, starts first with speculation. So, but I think, you know, we're in the domain of coming up with ideas and developing potential scenarios for the way things could play out. And through that, we have a critical commentary.
And one thing that thing that I found particularly interesting in your presentation is it brings, I mean, the drones are fascinating to see move the way that you represented. But how conceivably, the kind of technological transformation that you're addressing in your work has the sort of potential in its possibility for destabilization and disruption of dominant modes of production for kind of new, new almost kind of critical projects that could change things in what we might describe or attribute sort of positive values to. Like I know, for instance, Peggy Deemer at Yale is very interested in how the advent of these kind of devices and new sort of digital modes of collaboration can change what are commonly now exploitive relationships of production, or at least that might harbor that potential.
I'd like to try and link John May's presentation with Rob Stuart-Smith for a moment. So you can't, it's so tempting when you see the robot that it's like us, how cute or how scary, or it has appears to have some form of agency, but it really doesn't. You can only feed it numerical data, right? And there have been a couple of different approaches to the problem of what kind of data to feed such new instrumentalities. There are three. Like one is we compose, we draw the line, and we reduce it to data that then get fed in. Two, it has its own kind of self-emergence, so which I find the most dubious myself. That through some hypothesis of a self-generative, autonomous, generative, geometry or numerical systemic construct, that it will generate its own data subsequently, right? But like I said, I think that is the most mythological of them all. But third might be the data is fed in from outside of our agency. That is, it comes through some kind of economic mapping or social mapping that is completely non-architectural in nature. So this research into what is data, first of all, and what invisible drones that we're not studying are actually the substrate for producing this data in the first place, I think is a really fascinating thing to look at that I don't think we've ever really looked at before. And it is interesting to suppose, for me, that these kinds of researches inevitably get linked in some way, because the outcome of, say, your instruments project might be a different model, a different diagram of core, periphery, et cetera, where we can think of maybe new categories for generating the data.
Yeah, I mean, just that project, I mean, we've presented it publicly now only a few times, really mainly at a conference in Princeton last fall. And because we've been working in somewhat closed circumstances up until now, we were kind of shocked, actually, to be criticized as not only anti-technology, at times also anti-environmental. But there was a general atmosphere of Luddism somehow. And I think that's one of the things we're trying to implode, that somehow just to look at the techniques that we're all immersed in is somehow a non-generative act or something like that. But more significantly, I think it arose out of a desire to have a conversation about what we're actually doing in according to a framework other than either the autonomy debate or its successors. And I think the core periphery model is a successor of the autonomy debate. And I think there are two things that make the autonomy debate completely irrelevant for our lifetime. One of them is it depends on whatever sociological theory you'd like to take, but you could take Ulrich Beck's theory of reflexive modernity. That is, something happened after 1945 where, now for our generation, when there's a breeze, when there's a gust of wind, it has a different implication for us than it did before 1945. That is, there is now the specter, and we talked about something like the Anthropocene or something, right? Whatever term you want to put on it, I think it's a fundamental psychological break for our generation that was not there for the people who framed architecture around the autonomy debate. The other thing that I think is different is that the autonomy debate was immersed in a kind of techniques which we might call like the last vestiges of orthography. And we are now all swimming in this kind of post-media soup. We're perpetual amateurs. As soon as you've mastered a technique, it's already outdated. There's already a new release. We are trying to swallow media from all kinds of other disciplines and all kinds of other fields, whether it's film or computer science or whatever it may be. And that is why, again, I think all of the terms of the autonomy debate don't make sense, and why the core periphery model doesn't make sense. Because it would, to my mind, it would be a much more productive conversation to talk about those two interrelated consequences, or those two interrelated generational realities, rather than have one side of the generation talk about, I work on the outside, and the other side of the generation say, no, I'm defending the inside. I'm not sure what you're defending anymore, and I'm not sure what constitutes the outside such that it's not the inside anymore. So.
Well, maybe I can, is this on? Can you hear me? I can follow up. In this morning's session, I thought it was interesting about the core when people kind of put their cards on the table and really said, this is the core and this is not the core. And so if I can remember, Michael Young said, representation is definitely in the core. You said today NAAB, which I like. That's, it's a solid base, right, to think about.
It's far more stable than representation. I don't think we have representation anymore.
And I think Rhett Russo said ecology is not in the core. I think you said that. I wrote it down, but it's not in front of me, so I could be wrong. So everybody probably has their own diagram of what's in the core and what's not in the core. And I think Lydia Calipuliti said something that was actually very helpful for me, that maybe it's not core and periphery, but it's actually the friction, right? That the friction is necessary to drive the discipline forward. Maybe Peter Eisenman's what was he talking about? Authority is the core, right? The tradition of architecture, that could be. But whatever it is, we kind of need to go back and forward between what we think is the core and what we think is peripheral in order to kind of ask questions of one and the other. So maybe it's friction, and maybe what I was trying to say in my presentation is that we need a better way of stitching. In a way, it doesn't matter so much what's on the outside and what's on the inside, but we need better strategies of not being so superficial in the way that we're reaching out and pulling back in again.
Maybe one way to kind of take, David, your third comment about the, which I understood as like a kind of third-party appropriation, so somebody else is managing, and maybe the kind of challenge of considering whether we have, as a discipline, have an interface to engage with whatever it is. And if we do, then maybe it's sort of moving towards our center. But if that interface is very primitive, then it sort of remains outside. And I mean, in my own work, I think I'm probably in that third category of your kind of compose emergence. Emergence, I would argue, is composed. It's just composed algorithmically rather than formally. And then there's this kind of other where you rely on some kind of rawness of the data for someone else to process.
The data is given.
Right, as processed already or something like that. And I'm curious if, in my own work, if we kind of extend our interface for that data, so we're not relying on outputs or visualizations from external forces, but we have an interface to manage or confront it more directly if there isn't a kind of room for maybe a kind of a fourth in that list to kind of appropriate and manage the rawness through our own interfaces rather than predisposed ones or predetermined ones. And I think that's a kind of interesting instrumentality that I see.
There was a very interesting conversation that came out during the projects, the almost nearly unattended projects and research session yesterday, where in this project researching the developments at Dharavi, that it was pointed out that one of the major actors in such large-scale urban developments is McKinsey, and that they conduct their work primarily through text, and they remain incredibly invisible. Like nobody knows who McKinsey is in the architecture world, and it's kind of shocking, given the outsized effect that their knowledge practice has on giant developments. Why don't we know about it? And is there something about the way in which they're operating where we don't see it? But their data, I think, streams through us. You know? And I think it's a kind of obvious question for me that, well, so what do? We just reformat our interface with that stream of data to make ourselves as receptive as possible to the inclusion of such data, or do we resist that to some degree, or contribute on a kind of pushback with a new model, you know, or do we actually get in there with McKinsey and become McKinsey? And so I think these are, I think, very difficult questions that challenge this core periphery debate.
I mean, I think a kind of related question in a way is, you know, one can look, and I hear you, John, when you say, you know, I don't see what, because I think many of us probably would share that sentiment. So I think that the kind of polarization, I think you're dead on that it's problematic. But if one accepts that there are that there's research on the margins, I think there's a question of is that kind of pushing to the boundaries of what one might understand architecture an effort to feed back to the kind of interior of the discipline and reshape it, or a kind of alternative understanding would be that actually, and I think this was hinted at in a few presentations, that actually the more fruitful thing might be to actually be having impact on other disciplines, like that we don't look at the outside as a thing to mine to then somehow render architecture enriched or more complex, but that actually, you know, perhaps our role is to kind of then go in dialogue with, you know, people in political power or economic power, or people making ecological decisions. So I'm curious, maybe in relation to a lot of your research, you know, where you see the kind of impact or dialogue happening relative to your work.
I would say one really quick thing in that regard, which I think in many ways the question of what constitutes the core and the periphery within the discipline is not nearly as kind of pressing, and I think, pressing as the question of what is architecture, how does it relate to a larger idea of core and periphery, of agency in the world, right? And I mean, in some ways, the kind of question of the internal core and periphery, I think, distracts us from this larger question of societal agency, however we might understand it. But I think that intersects with what you're getting at, is that how do we kind of develop the language, the forms of representation, even though they may be shifting, where we're able to exercise some sort of productivity, right? Or productive agency. Because I mean, the backdrop to this whole conversation really, I mean, you know, the case can be made, I think, pretty strongly of the increasing irrelevance of what we do to the larger aspects of societal existence.
I was just thinking, when you were saying that, and before when Lola was speaking as well, about that perhaps one could consider the core of architecture to be where its economic base is, which would normally imply, say, the kind of commercial firm, like the large corporation or something. But if one were to consider that, then where does someone like Philip Johnson fit? Someone who, you know, was very overtly proud to be, you know, the kind of commercial, in a sense, even though provocateur at times. So is he core or is he periphery?
But I think there's also there's the model of practice and whether it sort of engages in, economic entrepreneurialism, or I don't know what the term is, but also, in light of Matthew's presentation, the fact that 90% of the 98% of the built environment is now driven by a set of forces. Even when there's an architect involved, there's a set of protocols and forces that are shaping what gets built, how it gets built, where it gets built, that we come in at the kind of tail end. And so the question of does engaging questions like economics or politics or ecology, is it to kind of to be able to better engage those outside stakeholders, which I think is starting to happen both in academia, probably more in academia maybe than even in practice, but in both. But it goes back to Matthew's question of where does our agency lie at this point, and who should we be having conversations with maybe?
Well, one thing that I appreciated about John's presentation was that really, I think one of the big things that you're addressing is actually the question of ideology, right? Like that the core and periphery as a model, when kind of unquestioned, is a kind of it's an ideology that frames a whole kind of discourse and set of potentials. And it seems to me that if one is going to understand where we sit in relation to a larger question of kind of core and peripheralness in terms of agency, is going to necessitate kind of some difficult grappling with ultimately ideology. And I think who knows exactly where and how emergent agency arises out of that, but it seems that that the at least the kind of primary step is to address those kind of ideological underpinnings.
I'm coming at this from the point of view of the discipline, and I'm completely unapologetic about it, and because that's also my only choice as I perceive it. And what I'm, I think, hoping for, and why I find some of this research so compelling and important and of interest, even though I am consider myself more about composition and representation than just making sure, and is I think I want to be aware of the nature of the forces that are being brought to bear on what I do, and in that awareness, maybe just the value system and the ethics of production are affected, without abandonment. So I'm curious, as I learn more about this kind of research and the outcome of, say, your instruments project, how is my sense of composition going to become sneakier and more tuned to the forces being brought to bear? So,
I mean, I would like to have, I would love to have a very clear politics. I wish that I lived in a time when political categories were stable and they made a lot of sense, and I knew what a human was. And then I could defend human rights. I wish I knew what liberalism was. And obviously, we don't even know what, one of the key components of neoliberalism is just to confuse terms. And so we have no idea if Dick Cheney was public or private. He was both. He did nothing illegal but profited at the same time, right? So I wish I lived in a time when that was the case, but we don't. And so I think there's a couple different pathways. I think there's the pathway of everyday practice when you have to be careful of your ethics, and you have to, there are very legitimate political fights to be had, and the TAs are striking right now at U of T and all of these kinds of things, right? Beneath that, though, there has to be a parallel project that tries to somehow reanimate our language, if that's even possible anymore, if our language even has the capacity to keep up with our techniques anymore, and I'm not really sure it does. But if this notion that we can, if we work on it, have language that to some extent contains or describes the realities we live in. And I think one of the things we've tried to do is say, there was an old politics of technology and humanism, and there was an old, and certainly Marxism had a lot to say about automation and employment and all of these kinds of things, but all those questions have become so incredibly complicated in our time, and it requires sometimes the invention of new terms. It requires looking at old terms and trying to reanimate them or fill them with historical or philosophical content to some extent. And that's a much longer range project. And you have, it's not defensible. It doesn't have any clear research results that come out of it necessarily. But I do think that a project like that, or that work like what I'm trying to present, that is trying to at least give some kind of pre-political raw material from which someone might have something like a technopolitics in the contemporary, right? And the point is that it cuts across all scales. The environmental scientists are using interfaces just like robotics engineers are using interfaces. Interfaces don't have subjects, they don't have objects, they don't have all of these things that the politics of humanism had. So in other words, yeah, I that's basically what I would like to just make stuff too. But you need an ethical framework in which to operate. You need some kind of compass, right? Yeah.
I was just going to add that I think the ethical framework that Matthew presented, obviously, I'm sure we all thought that number 16 was kind of shocking in a way. I mean, how do you know that one house for a disadvantaged community is enough? You know, maybe you need 100 houses. Maybe houses are not the right thing, but it's there actually not to give houses to those people, but to make you feel better about the decision that you made to buy the property. And we see that all over the place. We see that when we're shopping, right, for groceries, that you buy something that's, you know, organic, and you feel like, I'm going to pay extra for that, not because it's better for the world, but because I'm going to feel better. And I think one of the biggest problems we have in the discipline is the way that sustainability is, the effect that the image of sustainability and especially for big corporations to say that we're doing a green building, let's say, or whatever term you want to use, and LEED and all of those things, that kind of the ethics of the corporation or the individual feeling better, rather than actually looking at what would be better in terms of, maybe there's a kind of massive irony that the village that you're building the houses in Africa is actually the same place where the bauxite is being mined for the building, and it would be actually better just not to build the building. And so I think that kind of, it's a vicious cycle of ethics plus then the image of ethics, then the architectural response to that, and how it's kind of feeding or spiraling down into the core of the discipline.
Okay, we're approaching Tom Main time. So
T-minus 30.
I don't know if maybe we should let the audience interject, perhaps, huh?
Yes, I think there's a
Yeah,
microphone coming your way.
There's a mic. But it seems like underneath it all, you can hear me, right? It seems like underneath it all, the figure that's not really being discussed amidst all of this, not necessarily as a clarifying figure, but really one that I think might serve as an example of a precedent that was formed in a more simple time, but may actually serve as a precedent for guidance in this kind of environment is Corbusier's Architectural Revolution. I mean, it was sort of clearly framed as a matter of technology versus humans, and in a sense, training humans, in his case, to harness or be harnessed by and properly use the world around them. I guess the question is, if human goes away in that equation, can Corb be revisited in a more viable way? That in a sense, architecture might be looking for that figure to which, let's say, these technologies could then be oriented to be trained by and train that technology. Maybe another way of putting it is, I think as John is basically sort of talking about the impossibility of a politics. I mean, I would posit that what Corbusier was actually talking about was, in a sense, using architecture as a form of state building or state modeling, which sort of preempts or comes before a politics. So in a sense, maybe what is being discussed is not so much how do we make the world better for ourselves, or in a sense oriented around that figure, but really maybe a matter of building new states or new models of governance that technology actually where it would flourish and be innovative. But that would shift, in a sense, the disciplinary orientation that architecture has subscribed to for so long. So I guess the question is, what other figures that aren't familiar do you imagine architecture might orient itself toward, if not this human thing that I agree doesn't really exist in a definable way? I guess is that clear as a question?
I don't think I want to answer that, but you picked up on something. I was just thinking, like, there is a lot of discussion here about politics, economics, but we're not really putting any solutions on the table, so to speak. It's a very difficult question. I mean, I don't think we're going to solve it at this discussion right now. But what's interesting about Corbusier, though, is like the Maison Citroën was a project, that was his kind of answer to his kind of socioeconomic position, like where society was at that point in time, what he could strategize as something he believed was a good result that he knew that he could kind of leverage and get it on the market. So it came from a research side before it was implemented, but then at the same time it was, let's say, market ready as an idea, and then proliferated through all the different projects that came from that line of thinking. And now it's not so clear what would be the right strategy to tackle something like that problem. I mean, and the first thing that comes to mind as perhaps a new model is something like WikiHouse, which, it's all about kind of open source sharing of fabrication files, empowering local communities and individuals to share. And I could imagine that easily fitting into the ecological paradigm. But at the same time, it hasn't yet answered where it fits into economics, potentially. Like, I think it needs a little bit of tweaking, or where it comes back into design discourse beyond the kind of, let's say, the tinkering side of things. So, but I think that's something that is really worth us considering. Like, where do we push back again from an architectural domain within economics and politics?
Rob, one thing I would like to put on the table before we leave, we haven't put anything forward. One thing that for me has emerged through the 3 days is a possible modification of the model of single core, single periphery to maybe just a modest shift to multiple centers, multiple peripheries that are not necessarily even linked to each other. And I'm curious, going back now to my home institute and my practice, what would that mean exactly? I guess, just acknowledge that it's not monolithic. And maybe there's a different possible model for thinking about the discipline and experimentation.
It's funny, I've been thinking about the same thing, and I also like the idea of multiple cores. I think the one onus it puts, let's say if one associates cores with whether it's institutions or simply lines of thinking, is that it would enable kind of potentially even further entrenching of positions. And so I think that it puts a kind of additional onus on different lines of thinking to figure out how they engage with other cores, so because otherwise you could end up with sort of hyper-siloed positions that sort of say, well, we're now multiple and hence don't really need to acknowledge each other. And I think the kind of multiplicity gets interesting when you start to say, you know, there's a kind of technological understanding of architecture, but it engages with the political, or there's a formal, you know, understanding of core that intersects with some other sort of reading of it, so that there's always a kind of forced positioning relative to something that's slightly exterior to one's own understanding.
Any other questions? Oh, it's more for the videotaping purpose.
We're being recorded. This is probably just a fuzzy accumulation of a number of thoughts that have been circulating around as I was listening. I kept asking myself how many times the word building came up in relation to every single presentation or architecture. And a very small number. I mean, you know, Matthew was getting there sort of at the end, but I kept feeling that the condition of the periphery was far more dominant, obviously. And I also was thinking about the notion of disciplines. You know, I mean, coming back to mind was, you know, Foucault's The Archaeology of Knowledge, and the sort of definition of disciplines in relation to the history of all the artifacts, or the collection of all the artifacts that constitute architecture. All of the rules, the methods, the propositions considered to be true, and the tools, that these were the things that became the kind of collective cloud that in some way defined the discipline. And so I was asking myself, sort of within this definition, how the transformation of those things, the transformation of the objects, you know, in the last however long, the transformation of the rules, the propositions, and I kept seeing that cloud as getting more and more diffuse and much broader. You know, funnily enough, it became the atmospheric. You know, one of the sort of dominant models, let's say, that we've been operating within. The architecture was becoming almost ambient. And while I was thinking that, I kept, you know, there was still this sort of insistent image of the thing on the outside that everybody would understand as being architecture in relation to the building that nobody talks about. And for me, the dialectic may be between those two things, you know, the kind of insistent object in everybody's mind that nobody talks about, and yet the incredible diffusion of the discipline itself. That dialectic was what became the confrontation for me. And I want to put, you know, this isn't really a question. It was more, as I said, a fuzzy accumulation of thoughts. But the other two things that were coming to mind, both in relation to the conference and this session, was, on the one hand, also this, I kept thinking about architecture in relation to engineering, and that's probably because I've been feeling embedded in it so much in the nature of my own institution now. And how engineering, what was interesting is that there are many different disciplines within engineering. And they're always hybrid titles, right? That we think of engineering as, and you know, and Rob, you had a whole list of them, you know, in terms of your partnerships. And I was thinking that it was so much more about the methods of applying technology or apply, you know, to knowledge or vice versa, but they were always hybrids. And thinking, could I imagine architecture, you know, in that mode, the way that we operate with architecture as opposed to architecture sort of as the noun, as the thing. And the last sort of thought that I kept thinking about was the nature of architectural education in relation to the topic. The fact that, on the one hand, we're educating students and therefore, in some ways, emblematize the core of the discipline. But at the same time, you know, there's always the question about education in relation to practicing architects, that we're always operating at the periphery. And somehow that in and of itself is our own kind of strange schizophrenia that, you know, I see sort of apparent, you know, in the topic of the conference. And I think that's in some ways what to me makes it so relevant as a topic. So that's a comment more than anything, but more than a question.
I will offer that up as a closing comment, unless there are any pressing questions. There's about 10 minutes till Tom Main's lecture, so I want to allow people time to refuel on coffee. So I think maybe we'll call it an end of session, and we'll see you in 10 minutes down the hall. Thank you.